Hi. Thank you for joining live or coming on to the stream uh, after the recording. I hope that you're having a wonderful day in March, and I'm really excited to share this presentation or this talk with you. So, thanks. My name's Rosella Kennedy, and I am the founder and creator of Brave Sis Project. A couple of housekeeping tips. I believe this time it is streaming live to Instagram, which it didn't do last time. So that is a huge relief. But also, I'm not going to be able to really manage any comments in the chat. I will do my best. But last time I tried that, it was kind of a nightmare. So we're just going to get started. And thank you very much for coming in today. I'll try to look at the chat at some point. This talk is called Is Feminism Really White Supremacy and High Heels? And I want to start out, first of all, by saying, it was interesting because I got some feedback from folks saying that they found that title offensive and that concept offensive. I didn't make it up. Ijoma Oluo, whose work I find very helpful, had recently posted that in an Instagram post. And it seemed very intriguing to me, and it got me thinking. And it got me thinking about the histories that we learn and the mythologies that we learn about sisterhood, about feminism, about women, about solidarity, what's included and what's excluded. And so that's really what I wanted to get into a little bit today. So take a minute to settle in as I start, wondering, how does this sentence even make you feel? Angry, amused, defensive, fed up, frightened, frustrated, sad, overwhelmed, irritated, fatigued, ashamed, intrigued? Let's get into it and talk about this topic from a legacy standpoint of history. So I want to ground us in by referring to a 2020 paper I came across by two professors at Cal State San Marcos. Their names are Dreama G. Moon and Michelle A. Holling. And the paper is called White Supremacy in Heels: White Feminism, White Supremacy, and Discursive Violence. Now, we aren't going to be going into an academic lecture, don't worry. But their point is basically reminding us that feminism was traditionally and historically created as a way to combat the patriarchy, which is good because objectively, the late Victorian era coming into the 20th century was a horrible time for women, with very limited constructs about what a woman should or could do. And so, yes, suffragism was good for society. But due to the mores of the time, of its origin story, which is post-construction and early Jim Crow, and also the KKK era, let us not forget, early suffragism's absolute prioritization and centering of white women's experience without any regard or respect to the perspective of Black, brown, or Asian women, not to mention indigenous women, which we'll come back to in a second, meant that suffragism did not interrogate the narrative and therefore that only white women mattered. So I want to share a few things to underscore that point. White women gained the vote in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. But at that time, Native Americans were not even allowed to be considered United States citizens, not until 1924, which is extraordinarily ironic if you consider they were the original indigenous people of this land. So a federal amendment of 2020 did not give them the right to vote. And while we owe a debt of gratitude to Native American activists such as Zitkala Sa, whom you can read about in my book, Our Brave Foremothers, Native Americans were still stymied from being able to exercise their right in many individual states, even after 1924, because of things like literacy tests, poll taxes, and outrageous claims that because they resided on a reservation, they were not actually a resident of the state in which they were trying to vote. And as for Asian Americans, those born in the United States did have citizenship in 1920. But first generation Asian Americans, i.e., those who had immigrated in, did not. And those numbers were very small because the Chinese Exclusion Act, passed by Congress and signed into law by President Chester A. Arthur in 1882, limited almost exclusively to zero the amount of Chinese nationals and people who could come into the United States legally. The 1892 Geary Act extended this unjust law for another 10 years and additionally required that any Asian person, and mostly at this time they were Chinese people, anyone of Chinese origin needed to carry identification certificates or face deportation. And in 1902, Congress extended the Chinese Exclusion Act for another 10 years, and they made the extension indefinite in 1904. Now, eventually in 1943, the Magnuson Act repealed the Chinese Exclusionary Act. However, it only permitted a quota of 105 Chinese immigrants into the entire United States per year. And in fact, Asian American immigrant women were excluded from voting until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, a full 32 years after the passage of the 19th Amendment. So there is a shero that I celebrate in my book, Dr. Mabel Ping-Hua Lee, and she's known for working alongside the suffragists and famously leading a parade down Manhattan's Fifth Avenue as a 19-year-old astride a white horse. But she herself was never able to vote. Now, there were Latinx sheroes, such as Puerto Rico's Luisa Capetillo, whom I featured in a portrait in my 2023 Brave Sis Journal. And, people like Luisa worked to attain women's voting rights in the protectorate. Remember, Puerto Rico was and still is not a state of the United States, but it is a territory. So Puerto Rico did grant the vote to literate women 9 years after the passage of the 19th Amendment. So that was in 1929. And in 1935, it extended suffrage to all Puerto Rican women, excuse me. But you know how that goes. Racist conventions, such as literacy tests, ensure that many Latinas, notably those of color, darker melanated women, were discriminated against. And it wasn't until the 1975 extension of the Voting Rights Act that discrimination against language minority citizens was outlawed. This law allowed not only Latinas, but other women who were not English first language speakers to have access to suffrage. And last I counted, the state of California included 27 languages on its electoral ballot. And of course, there are Black women who were not explicitly given the right to vote, along with Black men, until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And just to give you some perspective, that I was 2 years old when that happened. And yet, we generally celebrate the 19th Amendment as the feminist moment de rigueur. The fact is, however, that when sex and or gender expression confronts race, feminism can become rather retrograde and one-sided. And that's the point of what I want to explore with you all today. Recognizing this fact without defensiveness, dismissal, or denial seems to me like a fundamental first step toward what I call building beloved community. And so one of the main reasons why I founded Brave Sis Project was on this notion of decentering the default whiteness narrative. So like if you're white, or you're any person in this country who grew up with white standards, advertising, cinema, books, storytelling, conventions, social norms as the standard, it's sometimes hard to even see difference. And that's what we're trying to get into here. So let's get into it. You know, we forget or we never learned about movements among Black women in the post civil rights era, such as the founding of the National Association of Colored Women, which was formed in 1896 by Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin and Mary Church Terrell. NACW, whose motto was Lifting as We Climb, strove to uphold Black women's honor and respectability in society through vehicles such as education, fine manners, temperance, etc. Now, while by today's standards, some would label these groups rather retrograde and anti feminist, or at least too intertwined with anti Black Victorian gender norms, I ask you to consider the long history of enslavement and the status of non personhood that Black enslaved women had to endure, and the effect of being so horrifically and systemically considered as sexually wanton. Now, this, of course, was an excuse for the abusive treatment of Black women as sexual chattel, breeders, and the concomitantly high incidence of rape among the population by white enslavers. Right? So it was a double thing going. I'm going to use this person as a human animal to create more wealth for my plantation, but I'm also going to label her as a sexual libertine and a loose wanton woman so I can justify my acts. This stereotype of the Jezebel carried on well past the end of slavery and, arguably certainly continues today as something that, a stereotype that haunts Black womanhood. So the women of the NACW were trying to create a counter narrative to this. And you start to begin to understand why respectability politics was so important and still remains important in many circles today. And it's also important to understand that by giving Black women across the country a standard of ladylike behavior to strive for, these groups were early versions of the kinds of overtly feminist collectives we will see 80 years into the future. Now, let's look at another shero of this era and her interaction with the fledgling white suffragist movement. This is Ida B. Wells Barnett. Ida B. Wells was born enslaved on July 16th, 1862, in Mississippi. She would go on to become a founding member of the the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. And actually, she won a posthumous Pulitzer Prize in 2020 for her courageous reporting on the horrific and vicious violence against African Americans during the era of lynching. Now, in case you think lynching was just vigilante chaos, I want you to consider that many legitimately elected officials, particularly in the South, were ardent supporters of the systemic annihilation of Black people. As a result, many of the social and political gains that were made by the formerly enslaved during the era known as Reconstruction was met by a backlash that was inevitable, swift, and heartless. I recently read about Pitchfork Ben Tillman, who was elected the governor of South Carolina in 1890. Previously indicted for murdering 6 Black men in order to teach them a lesson, Tillman infamously wrote, "We deny, without regard to color, that all men are created equal. It is not true now, and it was not true when Jefferson wrote it." Tillman became a U.S. Senator until his death in 1918. And in fact, in the book Black History AF by Michael Harriot, the author speaks of Governor and later U.S. Senator John Brown of Georgia, one of the writers of the Compromise of 1877, which is also known as the Great Betrayal. Now, this history is important, and I hope it's not too tedious. The Compromise was when there was basically almost a tie for the presidency against between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. So the Electoral College determined that the votes of Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, where there were large Black voter rolls despite the difficulties Black people had in voting due to poll tax, et cetera, to further disenfranchise this population, the Electoral College decided that those three states would be thrown to Rutherford B. Hayes. So giving him the presidency, and in exchange for giving him the presidency, 2 days before the presumptive winner, Samuel Tilden, was about to be inaugurated. The compromise was that Hayes could become president if he agreed to remove Union troops from the South. And that eliminated any protection for Black people. That was the end of Reconstruction, the institution of Jim Crow, and eventually the normalization of white domestic terror in the embodiment of groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Now, this guy Brown, this governor and senator, actually sought to repeal the 15th Amendment, and he introduced bills to, listen to this, legalize the practice of racist vigilante murder, aka lynching, as a means of preserving white power in the Deep South. I want that to just sit. I'm going to read that again. He actually introduced bills to legalize the practice of racist vigilante murder as a means of preserving white power in the Deep South. Does this start to sound a little familiar? How history repeats itself. Several of Brown's Senate peers were out members of the KKK. And there are a lot of stories and accounts of this time. So now, in that context, let's go back to 1892, when in Memphis, Tennessee, a Black grocery owner named Thomas Moss, who was a friend of both Ida B. Wells and Mary McLeod Bethune, Moss and two of his workers, Will Stewart and Calvin McDowell, were lynched in what became known as the People's Grocery lynchings. Now, why? They were in police custody and a white mob stormed the jail and killed them. What was their offense? Having too successful a business venture. So Ida, outraged, used the power of the pen to speak out against lynching, which earned her fame, but also clearly put her life under great peril. Wells Barnett traveled internationally, shedding light on lynching to foreign audiences. But through Ida's story, we learn about the often untold tale of anti-blackness, or at least vehemently held passivity within the suffragist movement. So let's get into it even more deeply. Many of the sheroes of the era refused to take up Ida's anti-lynching stance. Given the extreme violence of the time, the rise of the KKK and its rampant domestic terror, it can be said that white passivity equated complicity with mass murder. I want to give you some personal perspective. Have you heard of Red Summer, 1919? During this time, white supremacist terrorism and racial riots occurred in more than 36 cities across the US. Now, this violence didn't start, nor did it end, in 1919. Excuse me. Some count the era of Red Summer as beginning, with the deaths of more than 24 African Americans in East St. Louis, Illinois in 1917. And they consider that it extended until 1923 and the Rosewood Massacre, wherein a Black town in Florida was razed to the ground. All told, at least 1,100 Americans were killed in racial violence over these 6 years. Now, the term Red Summer was coined by civil rights activist and author James Weldon Johnson, who'd been employed as a field secretary by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People since 1916. In 1919, he organized peaceful protests against the racial violence. In 1919, my grandmother, Alice Green, was born. So when I talk about these things, it's not distant history, and it's not something just in a book. This is actually part of the legacy that I, and by extension you, live and walk through today. So back to Ida. Due to her activist stance, she was regularly ridiculed and ostracized by women's suffrage organizations. So she created a suffrage group for Black women in Chicago called the Alpha Suffrage Club. This was a group of highly motivated women who wanted to secure the vote for themselves and Black men as well. Ida and the group traveled from Chicago to Washington, D.C. Back in 1913 to attend a suffrage parade organized by the well-known activists Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. Now, because there were many Southern suffragists in the group, Paul argued that the parade should be segregated by race. She believed white women would refuse to march alongside Black women. The Black women should walk in the back of the parade. Now, I want to give you another bit of context that I just read about recently in the book by Melissa Harris Perry called Sister Citizen. I didn't know this, and I've been sharing it with some of you. I think it was 1923, so a little later, but showing you that nothing had really changed in the mindset, the Daughters of the Confederacy lobbied Congress and almost succeeded in constructing a Mammy memorial on the National Mall. This was an overt attempt to keep Black women in their place and to define them uniquely as caregivers and subservient beings to their white mistresses. Now, while the Mammy statue was never built, it was in fact commissioned. They got a sculptor to do it. And while maybe it never got made, Aunt Jemima prevailed as a cultural symbol for nearly a century. So I wanted to just think about that mentality. That was the compromise the white suffragist leaders of the North were willing to make in order to advance their political agenda. Well, anyway, Ida wasn't having it. She stood on the sidewalk as the parade began, and as the group joined, she got close. She joined them in the front of the line. Now, I want you to just think about how audacious that act of resistance was and how potentially dangerous. So Ida B. Wells is a real one. Now let's telegraph out a bit and think about how the history of Black enslaved women in the U.S. would create an environment in which a white woman would find equality absolutely abhorrent. Let's consider the time-honored tradition in our system of Black women being forced to provide emotional and intellectual labor in addition to physical labor, and of course, in addition to the men. This dichotomy is compounded by the complications of women being in a household together, existing side by side in that intimate domestic space. And add to this fact that many enslaved women for decades and decades had to serve as wet nurses for their mistresses' newborns, sometimes after their own infant would have been snatched away and sold off to another, or if not, would have had to subsist on sugar water because their mother's milk was being given to the mistress's baby. So you start to see how these horrors of history create some very complicated dynamics, maybe even epigenetic shame and guilt and sorrow and anger and distaste and disgust. It's important to understand these things. So coming out of this terror, we are led into we see a centuries-long history of white women, some of them calling themselves feminists, colluding with the patriarchy, Jim Crow, and other tenets of white supremacy in an attempt to secure their own rights above those of Black people of any gender. And now add the fact that historically and culturally, Black women is seen as strong superwomen, again, a form of dehumanization, or conversely, the flip side of the coin, the best friend, the emotional support, the sidekick for the white protagonist, rarely the center of the story. And this leads to constructs like, even within feminism, and I really want to ask you to think about this and see where you've seen it, constructs such as othering, diminishment, ridicule, or, laughter, dismissal. All of these attributes or affects being applied to the woman of color as the token starts to become a societal and cultural norm. And if you haven't been thinking about it, hopefully now you're thinking about it, because this can get twisted really fast. I know a Black woman, I believe she was in St. Louis, who recently shared the story of a conflict she had with a white woman coworker. And the coworker, in her frustration, said to my acquaintance, "Who do you think you are to address me in that tone?" So I want to elevate that this is not some rare kind of occurrence. These are the shadows that exist. And when we talk them out and bring them out into the light, then we can move beyond them, transcend them. Or yes. So when we think of feminism, chances are we think about the second wave of feminism of the 1970s, which is roughly connected to the era when women across America were fighting for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, right? The original ERA actually was written by our old friend Alice Paul, the founder of the National Women's Party. And here's a photo from 1921 at the National Women's Party headquarters, and Alice Paul is seated in the center. So, absolutely, thank you for sure, because they did do important things. They just weren't extending that grace beyond white women. Let's talk about the women's libbers now. Let's return to the 70s and the bra burning era. These committed women staged sit-ins, demonstrations, and other campaigns against things such as discriminatory hiring, demeaning events such as the Miss America beauty pageant, which objectified women. They protested against domestic abuse and, of course, for abortion rights, culminating in the passage of Roe v. Wade in 1973. And another accomplishment that they pushed for that helped all women was the passage of the 1974 Equal Credit Opportunity Act, or the ECOA. This law was passed in 1974 when I was 11 years old. And it stated that women could get credit cards in their own name. I don't think a lot of people realize how not so long ago that was. The ECOA was originally introduced in 1973 by Representative Bella Abzug, Democrat of New York, and it was signed into law by President Gerald Ford on October 28th, 1974. So yes to the sheroes of the era. Bella, Betty Friedan, the author of The Feminine Mystique, which blew it all open, Gloria Steinem, Germaine Greer, Susan Brown Miller, Adrienne Rich, etc., etc. And, there was activism taking place around the world, obviously. I think of French philosopher and writer Simone de Beauvoir. There was also the first International Women's Year, the first UN Decade for Women, and the first World Conference on Women in Mexico. All of these things took place during this era. Also in the US, we can think of Shirley Chisholm, who's featured in my book. I just watched the Netflix biopic, and though I thought it was really flat, I'm glad it was made. Thank you, Regina King. But Shirley was a complicated person, and in fact, in many ways, she countered a lot of the nascent intersectional discourse of the time by famously, or rather infamously, saying that for her, sexism was worse than racism in her career. When I ran for president, she said, I met more discrimination as a woman than for being Black. Men are men. Well, that might have been, I don't dispute that that was her experience, but of course we know we can't take the experience of one as a definition for all. I also want to give a shout out to Eleanor Roosevelt, who way back in the 30s and 40s did enormous things to help advance some level of agency for Black women, such as her friend Mary McLeod Bethune and others. During the late 70s, there also was the 1979 adoption of the Women's Bill of Rights at an event called the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. This was the most comprehensive international instrument to protect the human rights of women. It's the second most ratified U.S. human rights treaty after the Convention on the Rights of the Child, with ratifications from 189 nations, at least at last count. Now, this is a photo from the UK and her sign says Third World Women's Alliance. So there was a lot of really good activity happening at this time. I want to give props to Gloria Steinem. I know she's a TERF, which is a trans exclusive radical feminist, and that breaks my heart. But it also shows how important it is to remember that values and contexts need to be evolved and not fixed in time. So let's talk about Gloria for a second. She really did stand up as an advocate for her Black sisters in an authentic way. This goes all the way back to her relationship with speaker and as a speaker and co-collaborator, co-conspirator with the lawyer, author, and social hellraiser Florence Kennedy, who you can read about in my book as well. Gloria, I'm not dismissing her turfdom. She came of age at a moment when women meant possessing a uterus, and it is a shame that she hasn't evolved, truly. But in terms of her impact on 70s and 80s feminism and her embrace of her Black sisters, she does deserve a little bit of flowers. Gloria was recently interviewed by Black Enterprise magazine, and she had some refreshing things to say about Black women's history in the fight for gender equality. She, I quote, said, "I thought Black women invented the feminist movement. I learned feminism disproportionately from Black women." And she continued to say that in her earlier years, she noted how historically Black women were twice as vocal and opinionated around feminist issues and beliefs as their own white counterparts. A lot of these are the women you'll read about in my books, right? And in this, again, you can think of people like Flo Kennedy, Shirley Chisholm, as we mentioned, Ella Baker, and also LGBTQIA plus activist Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. Gloria admired these women, and she spoke about her personal practice of seating and creating space for their voices to be heard. She would give the floor to other young women, even if they did not self-identify as feminists, so that they could bring the concerns of people of varying social and economic backgrounds to the podium. And that is a hands way up for that. Even when she faced some of the younger Black women of that era who disavowed feminism, likely because of the stories their mothers and grandmothers told them of unsupportive suffragists at the turn of the century, or of abusive bosses of their domestic work, among other examples. Gloria didn't shut those young women down. She said, "I listened because the point is we help each other to get dignity, autonomy, and freedom. We're here to help each other." So on that, she is a super co-liberation partner and someone I was very thrilled to meet in about 2004 or 5 in Santa Fe. So I appreciate what she's done. And this photo is from, the first photo was from 1972 when she founded Ms. Magazine with Dorothy Pittman Hughes, an author and advocate for child's welfare. And then this photo is of them recreating the post many, many years later. Now, Gloria also worked alongside Alice Walker, making her one of the earliest Black editors at Ms. Magazine. And, this work did help establish racial balance in the nascent feminist movement, but it wasn't the norm. And at the other end of the extreme, there are no flowers to be given to the conservative activist, commentator, and author Phyllis Schlafly, boo, who single-handedly launched the successful campaign against the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. Shafley was an influential figure in conservative American politics and policymaking, conflating feminism and abortion with gay rights and the general collapse of a new term she coined, family values. So if you didn't know where this all came from, this was a backlash to 1970s feminism and other rights movements. Who are the white women like that today? Right, Shannon? Big boo, big boo. At the time all this was going on, there were many efforts in Black, Brown, Asian, and Indigenous communities to build their/our own rights and pathways. And you can read about them again, of course, in my book and other Brave Sis tributes, as well as, of course, other sources. Two that I love to mention are Grace Lee Boggs and Yuri Kochiyama. And please check them out if you're not familiar with what they've been in society and history. But I want to just take a minute to brush the surface of the emergent Black feminism of the era by quickly paying a debt of gratitude to some powerful foremothers, such as the Sisters of the Combahee River Collective. This is a Boston-based Black feminist lesbian socialist organization that was active from 1974 to 1980. And for context, I showed up at Tufts College in Medford, Massachusetts in the fall of 1981. So on the heels of all of this energy, right? The Combahee Collective maintained that the white feminist movement and the civil rights movement both failed to address their particular needs as Black women, and more specifically as Black lesbians. Here is Audre Lorde, the immensely influential poet and activist, a member of the collective. Demita Frazier co-founded Combahee Collective with sisters Barbara and Beverly Smith to resist racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression. Their work was pivotal in the development of contemporary Black feminism. And their groundbreaking activities preceded those of other Black feminists such as Bell Hooks, who wrote her 1981 tome, Ain't I a Woman? Black Women and Feminism. Now, I want you to know that this classic work of feminist scholarship was first drafted by Hooks, then known as Gloria Watkins, when she was a 19-year-old undergraduate at Stanford University. This would have been roughly 1972, contemporaneous with the Combahee River Collective. It was the movement of the moment. Titled after Sojourner Truth's Aren't I a Woman speech, Hooks examines the effect of racism and sexism on Black women, the civil rights movement, and feminist movements from suffrage to the 1970s. She demonstrates how sexism and racism contributed to Black women owning the lowest status and worst conditions of any group in American society. Examining the impact of sexism on Black women during slavery, the devaluation of Black womanhood, Black male sexism, racism among feminists, and the Black women's involvement with feminism, Hooks attempts to move us beyond racist and sexist assumptions. The result is nothing short of groundbreaking, giving this book a critical place on every feminist's bookshelf. Min Jean Lee, author of the best-selling novel Pachinko, gave Bell Hooks this tribute in a 2019 New York Times article in which she said, and I quote, "Now, 38 years after its publication in 1981, Ain't I a Woman remains a radical and relevant work of political theory. Hooks lays the groundwork of her feminist theory by giving historical evidence of the specific sexism that Black female slaves endured and how that legacy affects Black womanhood today. She writes, a devaluation of Black womanhood occurred as a result of the sexual exploitation of Black women during slavery that has not altered in the course of hundreds of years." Min goes on to say, "The economics of slavery, which commodified human lives and the breeding of more enslaved people, encouraged the systematic practice of rape against Black women. And this system established an enduring social hierarchy based on race and sex." This is basically what I've been saying. She goes on to say, Hooks' writing broke ground by recognizing that a woman's race, political history, social position, and economic worth to her society are just some of the factors which comprise her value. but none of these can ever be left out in considering the totality of her life and freedom. So thank you, Bell Hooks. Now, at the same time Hooks was publishing her work, queer Chicana writer and activist Gloria Evangelina Anzaldúa, along with collaborator Cherry Moraga, published a groundbreaking work also in 1981 called This Bridge Called My Back, Writings by Radical Women of Color. Now, she also in 1987 published her well-known tome, Borderlands, La Frontera, based on her life growing up on the Mexico-Texas border and exposing her personal experiences of social and cultural marginalization. Gloria's feminist lens attenuated introspection into the marginal, in between, and mixed cultures that develop among borders. And there was a great deal of activism happening among Asian American, Indigenous, and Latina women activists at this time as well. So all of this to say things were hopping in Black and brown feminism in the 1970s. And we rarely talk about that. Now, of course, today, there is an entirely new generation of feminists of color speaking truth to power and also working alongside other feminists of color and white women who have evolved into more intersectional thinking. Kimberly Crenshaw is one, of course. She coined the phrase intersectionality to describe the cumulative effect of the unique combinations of discrimination and privilege, such as gender, race, and sex, as we saw the suffragists fail to do some 80 years prior. But Crenshaw also added additional identities such as caste, ethnicity, class, sexuality, religion, disability, height, age, weight, and physical appearance. Actually, this kind of thinking informs a workshop I teach called The Privilege Staircase. And we cannot forget the important work of Angela Davis, who is seen in this photo taken just a few months ago, at the edge of the photo, and straight in the middle, 1, 2, 3 people over from Angela, is my daughter, Jade Kennedy, just to show how she's rolling. And I'm so proud of her and her friends, her group of amazing latter-day post-feminist intersectional people. So, okay, after all that exaltation, let's go back to that original paper. The authors state that by erasing women of color, positioning women as victims of white male hegemony, and failing to hold white women accountable for the production and reproduction of white supremacy, white feminism manifests its allegiance to whiteness and in so doing commits discursive violence. The authors call for ideological intersectionality as a possible corrective. What does that look like? I'll tell you what it doesn't look like. It doesn't look like this. Or this. You get the point. This was the 90s, my friends, the post-racial, token Black everything era. But the real question, though, is how can we relearn history and reset the narrative about who is considered a shero? And why does this matter to feminists and feminism today? Well, I'm going to quote Rachel Cargill in a 2018 Harper's Bazaar article where she wrote, "From tone policing to white-splaining, the liberal white women's feminism is more toxic than they realize." She went on to say many liberal white women have an immediate reaction of defense when someone challenges their questions, which is exactly what I received at the beginning when people were saying they didn't like the title of this talk. So I highly recommend this 2021 book called The Trouble with White Women, A Counter-History of Feminism by Kyla Schuller, with a foreword by the Crunk Feminist Collective co-founder Brittany Cooper, who is amazing. Now let's delve for the rest of this presentation into territory that most feminists wouldn't claim at all. But the reason I'm going to end with these considerations is to help keep us aware and vigilant about how ubiquitous some aspects of womanhood behavior remain in our society, and how porous the boundary often can be between being what is considered a good feminist and being a failed wannabe ally. So let's start with tone policing and a pop quiz. Which of these are examples of statements said to a woman of color by a white woman that constitute tone policing? in your opinion? Calm down. Don't make waves. Say it this way. You don't need to get so angry. The answer is all of them. And even if you don't say these aloud, if you think it, that's a little problematic, and I would ask you to put some attention on it. Other offenses that come into play here include white splaining or its cousin white exigency, which is like, I expect this of you as my black, brown, whatever friend. This is what I expect you to do. I put up a black square when it was George Floyd, and I want you to stand up for me and my identity in this moment, this way, right now. Another of the all-time favorites is white women's defensiveness. Wait, I'm going to go back to exigency for a second. I have so much lived experience of that. Some of you know I was patted on the head once by a board member for doing a good job. I just don't think that a white woman would have ever been patted on the head by another white woman. I just really don't. And it really was a mammy sort of feeling. And I actually left that place soon thereafter. Anyway, lots and lots and lots of that. And if you go to my any of my socials, LinkedIn or Insta, I think I put it both on Brave Sis and my personal Insta. There's been a group of Black women directors and who've been harmed in the workplace. And we've been meeting together to kind of talk through, to see each other, to understand the ubiquity of this harm. And if you go to the Instagram account, you'll see it there. It might be lost in some of the other socials, but it's really real and it carries on. And I want you to start now getting a sense of some of the roots and some of the history, right? I'm going to go back to another all-time favorite, which is white women's defensiveness, over apologizing, and therefore recentering the white woman, and something else that few would consider feminist, but it often rears its ugly head. We know this from Robin DiAngelo, white women's tears. Back to Rachel Cargill, in her article, she said, this type of behavior rests upon the guise of feminism only as long as it is comfortable, only as long as it is personally rewarding, only as long as it keeps on brand. But if the history of this movement has taught us anything, it is that the intersectionality in feminism is vital. Now, there's media representation, visibility, and narratives. Humor, the bitch boss, attitude girl. I used to love Ann Trainor's tongue-in-cheek pastiches of 1950s feminism until I thought about the fact that in the 1950s, my grandmother and her sisters were literally not able to vote and could only serve as domestics and nurses. So it kind of changes your perspective about some of this humor of our dominant culture. Now, then there are people like Kara Swisher and, Chelsea Handler and others. And I appreciate their badassery, but there's so much in that mimics characteristics of traditional Black womanhood that are punished when coming out of a Black body. And so you don't see Chelsea and Kara with huge fan following in communities of color. And I just ask you to think about that as well when you start thinking about who matters, who counts, who represents what, who's the voice and face of feminism. And this brings me to my conclusion. Let's talk about niceism. So this is like the frenemy vibes. It's like, oh my God, you look so beautiful when you're talking behind their back. This is rooted in fear. Is rooted in scarcity. I don't have the time to go deeply into this now, but one of the things that it generally does as well is it considers the white norm as the only one. So I might do something on niceism versus kindness at another point, but I just want to wet your whistle with that because kindness is what requires courage and decentering whiteness. Let's talk about late stage capitalism, the times we live in now, which prioritizes suburban middle class individualistic comfort, and it builds upon long-standing tropes about fearing the other and powder coating them with an electrostatic layer of scarcity, spite, and misinformation. This is the result. This results in many of us having in this moment abandoned a life of care and concern for each other. As long as my needs are met and centered, it's all good. So from mean girl competitiveness to my rights first and maybe yours, or if it doesn't bother me, to white women culture, and honestly, much of American mainstream culture has done a spectacular job of centering itself on individualism and forgetting the collective goodwill that we saw in some limitation with suffragists and in other groups with the can do, will make something out of nothing advocacy of many Black and brown feminists of the time. You start to understand why today so many Black and brown women and queer folks, and increasingly Gen Z youth across many spectrums of identity, reject second or third wave feminism altogether, right? White feminism was predicated on making waves and smashing the status quo. But I would ask you to take a minute to examine your own quos and statuses that might merit some redesigning. I believe it's really actually very urgent that we address this and think about this. Even Beyonce doesn't approach it this way anymore. This photo was in 2014. And what I have to say to that is what a difference a decade makes in the discourse. So that is the end of the talk. I want to thank you. I know a few people have come in through the various streams. If you saw that you were alone in one stream, fear not. I think there were 4 different streams going at once. So, and this will be recorded and put on the socials. So you'll have a chance. I wanted to remind folks there's one more week. I got to do my promo. I'm trying to grow this business here. There's one more week of the sale on the Brave Sis store. I don't look at that discount school. Don't even do that. I think it's 15% automatically marked off of everything, the t-shirts, the books, everything except for our Brave Four Mothers, which you can buy at any bookstore, including through RuPaul's new book venture, allstora.com. And here is that book. And I'd love you to continue supporting and uplifting Brave Sis Project. I'm just doing this because it feels like it has to get done and said and shared. I've been loving doing my cohort of women seeking to build beloved community. I may be doing another in the summer, but I have other exciting plans and things to announce. So follow Brave Sis Project on Insta, TikTok, a little bit, Facebook, or the website. I do a newsletter once a month, not more than that. And we can keep all sorts of good conversations going. Thank you so much for giving me an hour of your Sunday, and wishing you a wonderful end to Women's History Month. Keep it intersectional. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.